Okay, well, I'm going to continue as I've been doing through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, which, to remind you, section 6 is everything from near the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. So as I've outlined Matthew's Gospel, that's section 6. And this section describes the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. And of course, Matthew only records one visit to Jerusalem, but it's all here toward the very end of things. Now, I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders. And for a lot of this, the leaders of the nation get a lot of the sterner judgments from Jesus, but a lot of this, as we have seen, has to do with the entire nation as well, simply because they have not received him for what he is, the Messiah and the Son of God. Well, as of now, I'm teaching through within that sixth section, what I've called the fifth portion and the final portion of this section. And this is entirely given to the Olivet Discourse. This is a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples. It's Matthew chapter 24 and 25, the entirety of it. So really a very long portion of Scripture. And in this portion, Jesus describes and predicts the destruction of Jerusalem's temple and his second coming and the end of the age. So it's very much from that time onward. He's covering a lot of ground here in this particular sermon. And so far, after all this time, we've made it through the first 21 verses of the Olivet Discourse, or the first 4 passages according to the way I've outlined this, if you still have the long handout I gave you all that time ago. So we're making very slow progress, but I'm spending as much time as I need to be sure I'm answering all the questions I'm sure you have, and at least the questions that I know a lot of Christians have had about this particular portion of Scripture. So far, though, we've made it through the questions of the disciples, which are the questions which gave rise to this entire sermon that Jesus preached. We've studied what Jesus calls the beginning of birth pangs, which are the normal, recurring dangers plaguing the world between his first and second coming. So while most people take those as signs of the end, Jesus actually says specifically they are not signs of the end. He describes them simply as the stuff that happens in the world. We've also studied the tribulation of the church, which also continues from the first coming of Christ to the second coming of Christ, and he gives a somewhat detailed description of what his people are going to endure through all of that time. And then finally, we've studied the great tribulation of Judea, which is, I think, the great Jewish revolt against Rome and its terrible consequences. So whenever Jesus starts talking about the abomination of desolation and this great tribulation, the likes of which the world has never seen before or after, all of that, I think, is the time when the Jews revolted against the Romans and the Romans responded. After all of that, we are finally ready to move forward by one verse. And it's the one verse we're going to be studying today, and that's verse 22 here in Matthew 24, where Jesus says this: "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." And that is as far as we're going to make it today in our study of the Olivet Discourse, so continuing our slow progress through things. Now, today's sermon is called Shortening History to Save Humanity, which is how I characterize God's actions as described by Jesus here in this particular verse. And I've got 3 headings for you in my outline. So here to tell you at the very beginning where we're going with all this, I'll tell you what those 3 headings are. First, I want to discuss the word elect and some of the possibilities for what it means here in verse 22. So not just the general idea of Christians as elect, but what Christ might have in mind here in this particular verse. Secondly, I'll state my disagreement with the very typical understanding of verse 22, thinking it describes the great tribulation of Judea. I think a lot of Christians read it that way, perhaps instinctively. I don't, however, think that's correct. I want to say why I don't think that's the right way to read it. And then finally, I'll argue that verse 22 describes the entire time between the first and second coming of Christ and the end of this age. So my way of reading it is a little bit different from how most have read it, but I think there's good reason for that, and I'll explain what I mean when I get there. Now, of all the statements in the Olivet Discourse, I really do not think any statement causes as much frustration as verse 22, which is saying a lot given all that we have covered so far and some of the really difficult statements that we've encountered so far and all the time we've spent trying to figure out what some of these things mean. I still think verse 22 is especially difficult overall. I myself have labored over this verse, and I know I'm not the only one. I think most of my back and forth as I've been going through these things again has been mainly focused on making sure I've got everything right as far as I know about verse 22. So on the one hand, spending a whole sermon on this one verse might seem a bit excessive, especially since we've done a lot of that so far in talking about the Olivet Discourse. On the other hand, I know you all would have a great many questions if I just sped through this verse without hacking apart all the details. I know that if I just kind of went on with it, I'd get all these hands raised afterward, and not hands raised in worship, hands raised in questions. So I want to make sure we just do this correctly the first time. So the whole sermon on verse 22 is the order of the day. Now, to help you out with this, I've made yet another handout that I've given to you here, which shows, broadly speaking, the two ways that you could possibly understand this verse and some of the problems with each of them and those kinds of things. So hopefully, as a kind of cheat sheet, you can use this afterward to refresh your memory and maybe give it some more thought if you're not totally convinced by the sermon by the time it's over. So that is what we're doing today. So let's get started with the very first heading. And of course, the first heading, I said we'd talk something about the elect, which Jesus mentions here in this passage. I want to make sure we all understand the word elect and some of the possibilities for what it means in our passage today. Now, to say that people are elect simply means that they have been chosen. Elect is just a fancy word that refers to being chosen. And even in our day today, we sometimes still use the word elect in that very sense. After somebody wins the presidential election, we often call him the president-elect until he is actually sworn into office as the president. Why? Because he's the president we chose. Even though he's not yet assumed office, we chose him, therefore he is the president-elect. And sometimes a little more fancy people will say that they have elected to do something when they simply mean they've chosen to do that. So we still use the word somewhat in that sense of simply being chosen. Now in the Bible, the person doing the choosing is God, and so the elect are people chosen by God. This refers to the divine will in choosing certain people for some purpose. And often, though not always, the elect are the people chosen by God for salvation. I think if you were to go through the Bible, especially the New Testament, and kind of keep a tally of these, usually you're talking about people being chosen by God for salvation. Now in Matthew's Gospel in particular, he uses the word elect just 4 times. And they are mostly concentrated here toward the end of Matthew's Gospel. 3 of them are actually in Matthew 24. So 3 of his 4 uses of this word come right here in the Olivet Discourse, the first half of the Olivet Discourse. As for the other one, Matthew uses the word elect at the end of one of the parables of Jesus, the parable of the wedding feast. And that parable ends with Jesus saying, this is Matthew 22, verse 14, by the way. He ends that parable by saying, many are called, but few are chosen. Elect, which is actually the same word. If you look at the Greek, it's the same word, however it be translated. So many are called, but few are elect. Few are chosen. Now, for the other references to the elect in Matthew's Gospel, we can just reread today's passage and then keep reading a little bit further, and you'll see the other 3 references to the elect here in Matthew. So let's start in Matthew 24, verse 22. We're going to read down to verse 31. It says, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So throughout there we see the other three uses of Matthew, that is, of the word elect. Now with that context for the word elect, let's turn our attention back to verse 22. And at this time, I want to talk about what Jesus might mean in particular by the elect here in verse 22. And at this time in the sermon, I don't really want to give a conclusion. I don't want to give you an airtight argument right here, right now. I just want to talk about options. I want to talk about the ways we might view the elect here in this verse. And the conclusion, I think, will come later as we keep going through the verse and talk about the other things here. Altogether, I think we have three options for understanding who these elect are, and I want to talk about each of them and just kind of weigh them. One of them, I think, can be ruled out almost immediately. The other two are definitely options as we think about the entire verse. Now, some suppose perhaps that Jesus in this statement refers to the Jewish nation as the elect, so the Jews, Israel. Now, if we were speaking purely from an Old Testament perspective, the word elect almost certainly would refer to the Jewish people. They are the nation chosen by God, and they had that prestige for thousands of years. That was the whole idea. That was the kind of the driving force of the whole first part of God's plan for history. However, once we get into the New Testament, the word elect most often refers to Christians or even to Jesus himself as elect of God in some way, as the chosen one of God. In fact, in the New Testament, if you go through and find all uses of the word elect or chosen or anything like that, I don't think you're going to see any real clear reference to Israel as the elect in the New Testament. Certainly because by the time of the New Testament, God is now having dealings specifically with the church, which is both Jew and Gentile, and is scattered through all nations rather than just being one nation. I will also say, on this topic of whether the elect might refer to the Jewish people, here in the immediate context, here in Matthew 24, it's very difficult to see the elect as being the Jewish nation, just based on things that we have read here and now. And just to jump down a few verses here, verse 24, false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. So Jesus raises, interestingly enough, he does not expressly say that the elect can be deceived, but he raises the possibility that they might be. But for the nation of Israel, that is not a mere possibility. That is something that has happened over and over again in their history and has happened even now, as the nation has largely continued following their leaders as opposed to following Jesus. So we know for a fact that the nation of Israel can be deceived, so there's no if possible about it. It's not really what we know about them. So all those reasons, all those things, I really don't think the nation of Israel is who Jesus has in mind as the elect here in this verse, but it is an option people have raised, so I wanted to mention it. Option number 2 is perhaps a little more compelling, so we'll talk about that one. So the second option for who the elect might be, they may very well be Jewish Christians, specifically Jewish Christians. Now, in the previous passage, if we were to back up and reread what we've studied for a very long time about the Great Tribulation of Judea, we see that Jewish Christians were in danger from the Great Tribulation of Judea, even if they were, hiding in the mountains of Judea, as Christ commanded them to do, right? The whole idea here as we go back, when those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be a great tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Going to be hard times for everyone, but even those who hear what Christ has warned them about and have done it and have taken off trying to get away, heading for the hills, they're going to have a lot of problems. And there's a lot of things that could go wrong there, especially if it's wintertime or the Sabbath or if you got a baby. I mean, all those things are going to be really, really hard. So Jesus has recently in the Olivet Discourse had in mind his followers there in the land of Judea, Jewish Christians. Perhaps those who actually obeyed him and fled to the mountains, perhaps he has them in mind for being the elect in verse 22. Or perhaps they might not be the Jews who believed in Jesus and fled to the mountains, but Jews who would become Christians afterward. After things get going there with the Great Tribulation, and they start to see, that stuff Jesus said really is coming to pass. And, through that they come to faith in him, but they're still stuck there in the middle of everything, in the middle of Jerusalem while everything's going wrong there. And maybe they're suffering. Maybe Jesus has them in mind, right? Maybe those Jewish Christians are whom Christ has in mind. In either case, it's worthwhile to consider the possibility whether Christ might be thinking specifically of Christians there in the land of Judea, Jewish Christians. That could be what Christ has in mind for the elect there in verse 22. However, there's a third option. We must also be open to the option that the elect in verse 22 refers to all the elect everywhere, Jew or Gentile, no matter where they're living, that Christ might have more of a worldwide focus at this point. Now, Matthew's later reference to the elect certainly implies a worldwide focus. We read this as we were reading forward a little bit here in Matthew. If we look at verses 30 and 31 again, we'll see this. This is him describing the coming of the Son of Man. He says, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. That is a very much greater thing than just everyone in Judea. That is a worldwide kind of thing. And based on that, we might read that back into verse 22 earlier on and see all the elect as being all believers, all Christians who have come to faith, and everyone who is destined to come to faith for that matter, Jew or Gentile, regardless of nationality or place. So those are the three options we have as we think about who the elect might be. So as we read about verse 22 here, as we study it, as we try to figure out what more of this means, we need to be sure that we're examining all three of those possibilities for who the elect might be, and keep in mind how, how that might affect our understanding of the passage. So as we go through the rest of this, keep that in the back of your mind. It will certainly come out in my teaching as I'm teaching about this. But who the elect are is certainly one of the factors as we try to make sense of this particular verse. Now, to begin my discussion of verse 22 as a whole, I want to address the way I think most Christians probably understand this verse. It's hard to say, but I think most people understand it this way. I think perhaps a majority of readers believe that verse 22 refers back to the Great Tribulation of Judea. So basically, the idea here would be, as you read from verse 15 onward, you just keep reading into verse 22 as though it were all one passage. I think a lot of you, as you're staring at your Bible translations right now, if yours is divided into paragraphs, the paragraphs are probably divided that way. I think that's very, very common. And I think that's how most Christians, when they read this particular verse, how they read it. They think it's part of Christ's description of the Great Tribulation of Judea, the great Jewish revolt against Rome. Now, at first, this interpretation seems very natural. I think it's very easy to take it that way. If we follow this interpretation, when Christ refers to those days, he is referring back to what he just described, the Great Tribulation of Judea. All you have to do is go back one passage. And so those days refer back just a few verses. That makes sense. And if all that is true, then those days were cut short in that God brought the great tribulation of Judea to an end. So the cutting short of those days is how Jesus would be describing the end of the great Jewish revolt against Rome, according to this interpretation. Again, still following this interpretation, the phrase no life must refer to life only in Judea. So when he says no life would be saved, he's talking about people there in Judea. Their lives are the ones that were in danger, and those lives were the ones that were saved by the days being cut short. As for the elect, we would have to interpret this word as some group of Jewish Christians, probably, whether those hiding in the mountains or those who became Christians after escape was no longer possible. People there who were believers in Christ, but who were there very much in Judea. So some group of Jewish Christians would almost have to be how we understand the elect in verse 22. And all of that is how I think many readers understand verse 22 as a reference to the great tribulation of Judea. Possibly that's how most Christians understand the verse. Perhaps many of you out there right now are thinking to yourself, that's how I've always read this verse. Didn't know there were any other ways to view it. That may very well be how you think of it. Now, although many Christians read verse 22 in that fashion, and even though there's a lot of reasons why you would read it that way, I do consider this whole interpretation problematic in 2 or 3 ways, depending on how you break them up. But for several reasons, I think that way of reading verse 22 is a bit more trouble than it actually is worth. So first of all, if those days are the great tribulation of Judea, then Christ has used the word elect in a way which is far more narrow than how he uses it later on in this whole Olivet discourse. As I mentioned, when you get down to the coming of the Son of Man, and he talks about the angels gathering his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the sky to the other, you get very much the impression that that is a worldwide kind of thing, that it's not just the Jewish elect, it's the Jewish and Gentile elect. It's from all nations of the world. So not long after verse 22, we see the elect used in a very worldwide sense, which makes it a bit awkward to have a more narrow kind of interpretation of things here in verse 22. Maybe not a huge problem, but definitely kind of something that would catch your mind a little bit as you're reading through all of this and thinking it through. So that's one problem, maybe not a big one, but certainly worthy of mention as we think about the pros and cons of these interpretations. The other problem with this interpretation of verse 22 is that the shortening of the days seems meaningless to me if those days are the great tribulation of Judea. It seems to me that as you really think about the details here, what Jesus says here in verse 22 becomes somewhat empty if you apply it to the great tribulation of Judea. Now, to show you what I mean by that, I want to ask and answer 2 questions. So 2 questions here, again, thinking about verse 22, applying it to the great Jewish revolt against Rome, and whether it really makes any sense, if there's any meaning left in verse 22. First question, was there ever any threat of everybody dying in Judea? Because that's exactly how Jesus words this, right? Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So he makes it sound very much like everyone's life is in jeopardy at this point. And there's a real chance of no life being left if things are not cut short, as Jesus says. So let's ask that question. Was there ever any threat of everybody dying in Judea? Well, not really. I mean, things were really bad there, but as for a 100% death count, I don't think anyone really saw that. You got to remember, the Romans did not enter Judea to murder everybody. That wasn't their goal. There are a lot of people dead by the end of the process, but that was never their goal. Their goal was to put down a rebellion so they could once again collect taxes from the Jews, which is the whole thing the Romans care about anyway. Their whole idea is to make money off these people, so that's why they want them in their empire. Going in there and just laying waste to absolutely everybody would not accomplish that purpose. Now, as for the Jews themselves, they did a lot of damage to one another, as we talked about in earlier sermons. I mean, a lot of Some of the worst damage was done before the Romans even got there again to put down this rebellion. But still, nowhere near enough damage to the point where you'd think that everybody in Judea is going to die. At no point do you get to a time where you're saying to yourself, man, if this goes on much longer, we're all going to be dead. It's never quite that bad. It's bad. It's certainly the great tribulation of Judea, but never at any point was there a danger of there being no flesh left, no life at all. So it kind of makes Jesus seem a bit dramatic as he talks about it that way, if he's talking about the great tribulation of Judea. Now here's my second question. Was the war actually cut short in any way? As we look at this matter historically, can we say that things were cut short before the war would have naturally ended in some other way? Was there a cutting short? And again, I ask this question because of how Jesus words this. He says, for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would be saved. So, was the war really cut short in any meaningful way? I don't think so. I've spent a lot of time studying the Great Jewish Revolt, a lot of time telling you about it. I don't see any way that this war was cut short, that it ended before its time or anything like that. Based on what we know from those days, it's hard to imagine either side doing more than what they did, from the standpoint of warfare or mob violence, as it often was among the Jews there in Jerusalem, and putting down a rebellion. From any of those standpoints, it's hard to imagine either side doing more than what they did. The Romans especially, I think, did all that they could do. I mean, what's lacking on their list here? They leveled the major city of Judea, and they destroyed the greatest fortress in that country, Masada, by the end of the war, and over 1 million people died by the time that was over. I mean, it's like, what's left? I mean, if you have a to-do list for going to war, what could possibly be left over? I mean, they accomplished all of their objectives, maybe even a little more so. It's such an amazing thing that we're still talking about it 2,000 years later. So there doesn't seem to be any way that things were cut short in any meaningful sense that I can tell. Therefore, as we look at this great tribulation of Judea, we see that nothing was cut short. There was never any danger of all life being destroyed. These two things that are very much part of verse 22 don't really seem to apply very well to the great Jewish revolt. And that is the chief problem with this interpretation of verse 22. Even though it's very common and in a sense very natural as you're just reading it, it doesn't really seem to fit what we see here. If Christ is describing the great tribulation of Judea, then the actions of verse 22 seem to have no real meaning and no real fulfillment. I don't see any way that all life, or that if life was spared, that things were cut short so that life would be spared for the sake of the elect. It doesn't really seem to jive with me. So I've had a big problem with this interpretation for some time. I don't really think it's the way to go with things. So all that to say, I don't think we should take verse 22 as part of Christ's description of the great tribulation of Judea. So that is my problem with that particular way of viewing the verse. So now, having said that, I have to suggest another way of understanding verse 22, one that gets around all those problems and hopefully is sensible enough that it makes sense to you all. Well, my own preferred reading of this verse is that it refers to the entire time between the first coming of Christ and his second coming, and specifically ends with the end of the age, the return of Christ. Now, to get your minds ready for this interpretation, I want to maybe go off on a bit of a tangent here. You might consider this kind of a rabbit trail, maybe not on topic, but I think it is. I want to talk about whether mankind is an endangered species. Okay, kind of a hard-hitting, heavy topic for this morning, here on this Sunday morning. Is mankind an endangered species? Are we all at risk of just going extinct, like some of these other animal species that we've killed off over the years? Well, I ask this question because for the past 80 years, people have generally believed that mankind is at risk for going extinct. If you go around talking to people, there are all kinds of things that have people afraid that our days might be numbered, that we may not actually live very much longer based on all the things that we've done. First, we invented nuclear weapons. right? Giving us a way, an actual feasible way to end all life on the planet, especially during the Cold War. And there you've got two superpower nations, both with nuclear weapons aimed at each other, and all it takes is one of them to get really ticked off, and we're going to send out the bombers and the missiles, and then it's nuclear winter, the sun's blocked out, and now we're all dead. That kind of thing was a very real threat to people, especially during the height of the Cold War. Additionally, even the peaceful use of that nuclear energy could be destructive, like at Chernobyl. You've got these nuclear power plants and you're not keeping a careful eye on them. Things can go really wrong very quickly. And if you don't know anything about Chernobyl, you might want to look that up, because basically it polluted all of southeastern Europe with this heavy cloud of radiation, which caused a lot of trouble. If that happened in more places than one, humanity would be in for a very rough season from all those kinds of things. Eventually, we created germ warfare, another way of winning wars, or if you can say if people could win wars in that fashion. Germ warfare. We start perfecting diseases, raising the possibility that we might create some new plague that gets out of control. Yeah, you meant to release this just on your enemies, but now it's everywhere, and now everyone's getting sick and dying. Germ warfare, another very real threat. Also, through all this time, we're becoming more and more aware that outer space is a very dangerous place and presents dangers that maybe we didn't think of before, like asteroid collisions or some comet hitting the Earth. I mean, here we are doing all things like normal, then all of a sudden an asteroid hits us and now it's like we're gone, right? The Earth was pulverized. You know, and scientists have said that sort of thing has happened in the past, if you believe their time frame for all those kinds of things. That sort of thing has become a real threat. And you know, we got guys watching the sky to make sure we'll have some warning, but first of all, what are you going to do? And secondly, they can't watch the entire sky, can they? It's actually very hard for them to do that. So you got all those kinds of things. Furthermore, we're also afraid that we might destroy our own planet through pollution, or overusing our resources, or reproducing beyond our ability to support ourselves. Too many people, not enough food, not enough resources to take care of everybody. And we're polluting half the planet all the time, so maybe we can't sustain life any longer on the planet. Those kinds of things also on people's minds. Finally, and regardless of whether you believe this to be a threat or not, many people do, they would say that global warming might destroy us all. We heat up the world so much that we can't really thrive here anymore, and now we've got that problem. So all that to say, it's not really a question of whether there's a danger for humanity. It's more like, what danger do other people think are most real? But everyone's walking around with this general idea in the back of their mind that mankind might not make it. Mankind might not survive. We've become very skeptical of our ability to survive based on things that have happened within the past 80 years or so. Now, I tell you about all that only to bring up this point, that Christians have an answer for this. In fact, I think of all the people in the world, we are perhaps the only ones who have an answer for this. Christians have a ready answer to all of these concerns. Our official answer has always been that we know from the Word of God what plans God has for us, and that annihilation is not part of the plan. That at no point in the future time, however long this age endures, we know that God does not plan to wipe out every single human on the earth through any of these cataclysms we've been describing. That is simply not in the books. Literally, it's not in the Bible that that kind of thing is going to happen. We believe that Christ is returning and that He will return to this earth well before we ever destroy ourselves. So before we can get to those kinds of doomsday scenarios where there's really this threat of all mankind dying out, before we even get there, Christ is going to return at some point before all of that. Now, granted, the only people who will benefit from the return of Christ will be the elect. But all the same, mankind will endure. It may not be a good thing for everyone on the planet when Jesus finally shows up, but at least for those who are elect, it will be a good thing. For those who are believing in Christ, it will be the best possible thing. In other words, you might say that God will cut short human history before we all get to a point when no life remains for the sake of the elect. And I word it that way for a reason, because that is exactly what I think is going on here in verse 22 as we read this particular passage. So I want to talk about this again with all those things in mind after my long rabbit trail. Again, I think verse 22 is expressing the exact hope that we Christians have regarding all these calamities people fear and all of the fears around us that mankind might be going extinct someday. When Christ refers to those days, he is not merely referring to the great tribulation of Judea, but to everything he has been describing. The birth pangs of wars, rumors of wars, and famines and earthquakes, as well as the tribulation of the church. All of these dangers that recur and in our past 80 years, as we have seen, get progressively, possibly worse. All those things, I think, are what Jesus has in mind when he says those days here in verse 22. When Jesus says that those days will be cut short, that is the second coming of Christ, which brings an end to the birth pangs and an end to the tribulation of the church and the end to anything that would endanger us and bring the risk of killing off all of mankind. When Christ returns, those threats are no longer on the table. When Christ says that no life would be saved apart from the shortening of the days, he is amazingly saying that mankind actually would be on the pathway to destruction, maybe even self-destruction, were it not for God's intervention. He is saying that God has his hand on this, and he's going to make sure that we don't mess anything up so badly that we actually kill all of ourselves in some terrible way like all these people fear. God is going to make sure that we never get to a point when no life has survived. God is going to make sure we never get to that point. He is going to protect mankind in that sense. And of course, when Jesus refers to the elect, he means all of his people for all time. Because God loves his people, because God cares about people, and wants to bring them all the way through to salvation, and wants to have some people alive on the earth when Christ returns. For all those reasons, for the sake of the elect, God is going to make sure mankind never deletes itself from existence or anything like that, or that no asteroid comes in and does it for us or anything like that. All that to say, that's what I think Christ is saying in verse 22, that it refers to the entire time between the first coming of Christ and his second coming, and the cutting short of things is the return of Christ. And it's all about the care that God has for mankind for the sake of his elect, in preserving us from ever getting to the point where we all become just absolutely non-existent. Now, to be fair, I will admit there are problems with my own preferred interpretation, and that's why I have those listed on that handout in front of you as well. There are some problems with this. First and foremost, according to my view of it, we have to explain those days by reaching back somewhat earlier in the Olivet Discourse. We can't just go back to the previous passage about the Great Tribulation of Judea. In my view, we've got to reach back even further. We've got to go back to the birth pangs, the tribulation of the church, and kind of bring it all together, which might be a little bit unnatural to you. I think that's fair to point out that that might not be the way you first read it when you first read this passage. So that might be a bit of a problem. Secondly, I doubt that people in the time of Jesus believed that mankind could ever be destroyed or could destroy itself. As I said, our doomsday fears that we have pretty much came around about 80 years ago with the advent of nuclear weapons. Until then, we might have been afraid of dying, but the idea of all of mankind going out of existence probably wasn't on anyone's mind. I don't think so. Maybe during the days of the Black Death, that's the only thing I can think of from history where they might have gotten to that point, but that's still not the time of Christ, is it? So, in other words, my interpretation of verse 22 deals with a concern that probably no one then and there actually had. Now, of course, Jesus is more than just an ordinary man, and he has a bit more insight in the ways of God and the capacity of humanity. But, all the same, he's not talking about anything that his disciples may have had in their minds. So that could be a bit awkward. So there are problems with my view, I want to admit that. So really what it comes down to is choosing what set of problems you want to deal with. You want to deal with the problems of the other interpretation or the problems with the one I think is better. So they both have some measure of problem to them, but you just got to choose which one is least problematic to you. And all things concerned, all things altogether, I think my interpretation that I prefer is less problematic. I think if we understand verse 22 as referring to the birth pangs, the tribulation of the church, ultimately the return of Christ, and God preserving mankind for the sake of preserving his elect, I think taking it that way is the least problematic of the two, as I view it all. So anyway, That is my view of these things in particular. And that's how I understand it. That's really the argument I wanted to make today about these things and how I understand this particular verse. Now, as I said at the beginning here, my sermon here has been called Shortening History to Save Humanity. And you can see why I name it that, because that's what I think is on the mind of Jesus here as he talks about these things. God is going to cut short history before we make too much of a mess of things and actually end everything. God is going to cut all that short to save some of us, and especially his elect, to be alive at the return of Christ. And I know this has been, for the most part, kind of slogging through details and weighing options and all that kind of thing. But if I'm right about all of this, the overall result is something pretty incredible. First of all, that God cares about humanity, that God actually wants to preserve us and wants to preserve things against our own foolishness or against any kind of natural disaster that we ourselves could not prevent. Even though we don't have a hand on everything, and even though we're kind of out of control, God is in control, and God is looking out for us, and God is trying to safeguard us, all for the sake of his elect in particular. That God is actually keeping an eye on things in the entire world and keeping a check on humanity's own evil and keeping a check on any outside threats that we don't know about yet. God has a hand on all these things for the sake of his elect, for his people. That God is governing all things for the sake of his people. These are huge ideas, that God cares that much and that God is that active, God is that watchful for our sakes. So in spite of all the details and the options and the questions on how to view this, if I'm viewing it rightly, then this is a pretty tremendous statement, and we can be thankful to God that he has this level of care for us and that he is always watching out to make sure that things go according to plan and that the elect always survive and that mankind therefore always survives. So let's do a bit of a summary here just to remind you of things that I've said. First, I discussed the word elect, some of the possibilities for what it means in verse 22. I kind of dismissed the option that it refers to the Jewish nation in particular, but I did raise the option that it might be Jewish Christians or might be Jew or Gentile Christians throughout the world. So we raised those options, and I said we had to keep an eye on them as we were going through verse 22 as we assess all the different things that we're talking about today. The second thing I did was I stated my disagreement with what is perhaps the typical understanding of verse 22, in which people usually understand it as referring to the Great Tribulation of Judea. I do not think that is the case, and I made the point as to why I don't think that. I think its view of the elect is maybe a bit too narrow, but mostly also I think because it makes verse 22 somewhat meaningless when you apply it to the Great Tribulation of Judea. I prefer instead, as I argued, to take verse 22 as referring to the entire time between the first and second coming of Christ, and especially the end of the age when God cuts things short with the return of Christ. And I made the argument that it's all about God's care for mankind and keeping mankind alive until Christ actually does return. And I gave my argument for that at that time. So that is really all I had for you today. Now, in my next sermon, what I want to do is I want to keep going with where we've been going here. So verse 22 and onward a little bit. I want to talk about the problems with preterism next time. Now, preterism, if you don't remember, with regard to the Olivet Discourse, is the belief that the entire Olivet Discourse is focused entirely on events from the first century. So all the way back to those times, and doesn't have any forward-looking aspect at all. That is what preterism thinks, which I consider to be incorrect. I do not think preterism is a good way to view the Olivet Discourse. And next time I want to talk about the problems with preterism and give you some guidelines for how we should read the remainder of the Olivet Discourse. As we get into these following passages, we're really getting into that kind of thing. And whether the return of Christ is even mentioned in the Olivet Discourse and how to understand some of these passages. So I want to give you some guidelines for how to think about all that as we go further in Matthew 24 and 25. So that's what I'll be doing next time whenever I preach again. And that is all for today. If there are questions that you all have, I'll try to answer them. And we'll see. Otherwise, we'll move on to our mealtime.